The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus spoke this parable to the disciples. The King of Heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going on to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Lord Jesus Christ.
There are many ways in which we perhaps, if we think back on our lives to childhood or even recently, where we've experienced envy or jealousy. And what is it with that? Where does that come from, you know? It's not that we want to make other people look bad, but we want to make ourselves look good, and we feel hard done by sometimes. I can think of a story of when I was a kid. I was about 8 years old and I was in school. It was probably grade 3 maybe. And it was just after Christmas holidays. We'd just come back to school. And it was show and tell time. We were supposed to get up and talk about what we did for Christmas and how good a Christmas we had. Well, I was excited to talk about my Christmas because we went to the farm and we went to see my cousins, and I got a snowmobile ride for the first time, and we got toys for Christmas and all this. So I was all set to go up and talk. And the person just before me went up. She had just been to Disneyland. And I thought, oh God, okay, so I could go up and tell about my little farm story, you know. And as a kid, I thought, oh, what's it like to go to Disneyland at the age of 8 years old? And it's just, to me, that was like going to Jupiter or Venus or something. It was so far off my radar, you know. But I just remember that feeling, that kind of, oh, you know, wouldn't that be great to go? And why don't they get to go? And, you know. And so, you know, those kinds of stories we can all relate to in different ways. And certainly, maybe our older generation, for example, we think of the conveniences that our kids and our grandkids have. It's amazing how well they can show you how to fix your computer, and they're like 6 years old, or your phone, and you're kind of stunned. And you're thinking about the old days when there was one of these kind of phones, that you had to wind up and outdoor bathrooms, and how quickly life has changed and how more convenient it is. And, these kids don't have to go through anything we had to go through, and we can get a little bit bent out of shape. But though we're glad for those conveniences today too, I'm sure. But envy and jealousy, where do they come from? Because their experience is often rooted, if you really look deeply, why we feel envy and jealousy, it's because there's a fear under there somehow. Is it a fear of being left alone or being left out? Or of not being included? And if we fear we're not being included, that quickly sprouts into feelings of not being good enough. And we can feel less than. And that's intimidating, and that's frightening, and somehow threatening. And these are all too common feelings that we experience in our human weakness, in our frailty. And we can see also how a 2-year-old child it's impulsive, it's part of our DNA, a little 2-year-old kid. When mom's been on the phone too long or paying attention to company too long, that little one will start crawling over mom or trying to turn her face and get some attention and, do whatever it takes to get that attention back. Why am I not getting attention that I think I should be getting? Well, as alluded to in the gospel and all too common in our world, there's also the issue of entitlement, which often is a manifestation of maybe a bit of arrogance, a bit of lack of humility, and certainly a lack of gratitude. And when we find ourselves beginning to work more for ourselves than for the common good, we're working out of a sense of entitlement and starting to seek reward for ourselves. And working under such an illusion breeds more self-interest, lack of gratitude and humility, and thus a greater rift between us and the ways of our calling as Christians. The workers in our gospel who worked all day and were resentful of those who worked less for the same pay are a lot like the older brother in the prodigal son story. That sense of duty, we're doing it all, and we're not getting the recognition, or maybe we are, but then someone who seems to be sloughing off seems to be rewarded for that. What's that about? And then we start to think we're hard done by. With such an attitude, we may still be doing the right things, but mostly out of bitter duty. And if we're in that state, we're kind of secretly envying the amoral. Let's think about that. In a way, such things come from a place that still sees life away from God's house as fuller than life inside God's house. Why are you envying? You should be celebrating. You're in God's house. What's better than that? So as Ron Rolheiser puts it, we're kind of like embittered moralizers. And we can probably see ourselves in this light at times. Think of the times when you perhaps look down on people who appear to be living less disciplined lives than you. They seem to be looking for the good times all the time and not bearing down with hard work or consideration of other people's feelings. But not only are we invited to respond more gently to those whom we're tempted to resent, we need also to be more gentle with ourselves for thinking that way. As Ron Rolheiser puts it, he thinks such thinking is an occupational hazard for good, faithful persons. In a way, it's kind of natural that we do feel that way in a certain sense. The truth is that we can be people who have everything and enjoy nothing. That's the difficulty, because we're watching what everybody else is getting. To experience life as a true child of God means that we find joy in every other person who finds their way to God. That's something to celebrate. If we don't find joy in that, we must reflect on that notion. Why don't we? What part of us doesn't feel like we're fully a part of that joy ourselves? So the next time any of us feel like crying out favoritism or nepotism or that's not fair, ponder where that is coming from. Are we able to open our hearts wide enough to realize that in the grand scheme that same favoritism applies to us? We are favored by God. Do we not see that? Sometimes it doesn't seem like it, but when we look really deep, that God has been and continues to desire to be overly generous to us also. That God's love for us is the free gift that belongs to all of us. Perhaps it's because we're reacting to the injustices of the world, of which there are many, that we're suspicious of unjust favoritism, which comes in many forms in this world. There are injustices in the world, certainly. Perhaps the master in our gospel, divvying out the rewards, is perceived as being overly generous to some and underappreciative of others when seen through the eyes of a broken world where there is much deceit and a lack of generosity. But we can't allow ourselves to get lost in that thinking. There's a much deeper picture. And interesting how, had all the all-day workers not known about the equal payment of the others who worked less, they would have been perfectly content with what they'd received, and they would not have felt underappreciated. It was that extra awareness that started to gnaw at them that made them feel unappreciated and start to compare. You see, our limited human minds only afford us a limited small sense of what is right. And we need to be aware of that. And we must humbly learn to live by that reality. We're called to pay focused attention on our own relationship with God and not stray by trying to figure out how God's working or should be working in the lives of other people. We can get knotted up, and it takes us away from our focus on our own relationship with God. In a world ruled by a mix of both generosity and self-interest, we must be mindful of the words of the first reading. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Put in the grand scheme of eternal life, the conflict and resentment generated by fear and worry over not having enough or of others getting more than me dissolves very quickly. So we need to catch ourselves when we're triggered into the impulsive reaction to complain or be resentful that's stirred up when we perceive others as having more than us. It's such a colossal part of the reason for the unrest and violence in the world, both globally and in our personal lives. You know, when we're little, we get upset when we don't get enough, or so-and-so is getting more than me, and we fight over our toys, and in a way that's still going on in the world. Fighting over resources, fighting over land, fighting over privilege, fighting over material things, fighting because of pride. The spirit of the gospel and of the early church was one of open sharing without fear of not having enough or of being left out. True community. In God's world, there's an overabundance of what is most important if only we would allow God to lead us. It's the fear that keeps us from experiencing that. This is the world which we, as followers of Christ, try not only to live by, but inspire others to live by too. Mindful of the world we live in, which cries out in fear of insufficiency, of not having enough. And so, as we prepare to celebrate Eucharist together, we're mindful of that frailty within us. And it's the grace of God that allows us to transcend that fear. It allows us to choose to forgive, Choose not to be envious. Choose to transcend jealousy and concern that goes beyond what God has put in our plates to be concerned with. Let's ask God to bless us with the wisdom to know what He has put on our plate, to know what that is, and not be tempted or distracted by those around us and how God is working with those people. We celebrate what God has given to us to work with, and we ask God to bless us with the ability to work with that, to stay focused on that, and in that way allow His Spirit to bring us together in the body of Christ.